Forget Swiss bank accounts, the Cayman Islands, or cryptocurrency. For the last 30 years, if you wanted to turn your dirty money into clean wealth and influence, London's calling. It's the dirty money capital of the world. When you think money laundering, you might think of Walter White, the car wash, and Huel making a money angel on a pallet of bills. The crystal meth kingpin of the Southwest has nothing on London, which on any given year will take 23 to 57 billion with a B pounds from dirty money by the hungriest hungry hippos of the former Soviet Union's oligarchs and kleptocrats, and turned them into legitimate businessmen with an industry of lawyers, real estate agents, and educational institutions lining up for a piece of the pie. How did London become the place to be for Russian oligarch money? We'll tell you. But first, you don't need a shell company or fancy lawyers to get first access to the latest richest videos. Just hit that like and subscribe button there. If there's one theme that we could assign to the 20th century, it would be the end of the Age of Empires. The sun finally began to set on the British Empire officially with the handover of Hong Kong back to China in 1997. At the beginning of that same decade, the Soviet Union became the former Soviet Union, and many of the smaller countries behind the Iron Curtain regained their independence. Two former empires ended up looking for a new position in the global economy. For its part, the United Kingdom still had holdings of small island nations that became a European-adjacent way to store money with less than a robust system of accounting for where that money came from, which was handy for the rising oligarchs of the former Soviet Union who were rushing to take command of the formerly public-owned wealth up for grabs. Enter one more key element, Margaret Thatcher, and the deregulation of the banking industry. This meant that with a creative lawyer and accountant, it became easy enough to create shell companies and move money about through offshore banks still under the Union Jack until its original owner was completely obscured. The kerosene on the fire was a London mayor named Boris Johnson, who went on the record as wanting to attract the money of Russian millionaires. It wasn't just Johnson either. The London Stock Exchange opened the doors to several Russian-held companies, actively courting them in the hopes of making London their European base of operations. It's more than just legitimate bank accounts that London has to offer. The London address grants them legitimacy, access, and influence the way that lots of money tends to do. From London, they can turn criminal power into even more powerful legal power. How does dirty money work its way through London and come out the other end as wealth and influence? The Financial Times outlines a 4-step process of placement, layering, integration, and protection. The first step, placement, happens outside of London. Chances are one's ill-gotten gains have already moved through accounts in countries not all that interested in where the money comes from, like a Cayman bank account. You want that money to now be in the British pound in a London bank. In principle, they'd be required to file with companies' house registry. There, you are meant to log whose money it is specifically, which is to say not just the businesses but the chief beneficiary of the company, namely the company's owner. The verification for that, however, is about as robust as the box on a website that asks if you're 21 years old. Approvals generally happen within 24 hours. The whole process costs all of £12. Now, you are a legitimate shell company registered in London. That money is still only 1 degree of separation from you, or more importantly, how you got it. That's where layering comes in. You need to undergo a series of complex financial transactions with a series of essentially made-up companies and accounts moving through the banking system in overseas holding like the British Virgin Islands until it works its way to London itself. Financial Times in their report identified 86 banks that would end up facilitating this process. Once this elaborate game of hot potato ends, the money could land in the hands of yet another shell company. If that company is an offshore one, you don't have to give up who owns it. Those offshore shell companies can buy property and assets within London and still never tell anyone who owns the shell company. This has given rise to a cottage industry of lawyers that help facilitate the legal process and realtors to facilitate those purchases as part of the process of integration. According to the report, 84,000 properties are held anonymously in the UK, estimating 6.7 billion worth of UK property likely in the hands of shady money. In a common occurrence of if you can't beat 'em, buy 'em, that money has been used to buy up the media itself, further decreasing the chances of their activities getting press attention. With property ownership comes access to the House of Lords. Yevgeny Alexandrovich Lebedev, owner of Lebedev Holdings Limited, which owns the Evening Standard, ESTV, a London TV station, was granted life peerage by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson in 2020. That essentially makes him a baron and sits him in the House of Lords as a crossbench, a term for independents and members of minor parties. Lebedev insists that he comes by his wealth legitimately, but it comes from a system overrun by kleptocracy. More concerning to some, he is the son of a former KGB First Chief Directorate whose position moved his family to London when Yevgeny was 8 years old. Johnson granted the peerage over people's complaints, disputing a report suggesting Lebedev's ties to the Russian oligarchy. Critics point to the system that makes it difficult to differentiate between legal wealth and illegal wealth. Despite association, Lebedev's wealth is legitimate, and Johnson went ahead with granting him peerage. Another factor was a 2008 investor visa program, dubbed Golden Visas, that granted residency to anyone who invests £2 million. After the poisoning of a Russian journalist in the UK in 2018, the program was reviewed and found an undisclosed number of applicants with criminal backgrounds, with 10 of them ending up on a sanctions list after the invasion of the Ukraine. The program was finally ended in 2020. The organizations meant to watch the financial chicken coops are ill-equipped at best. The report notes that the Serious Fraud Office has an annual budget of £50 million, which is the kind of money these entities deal with over the course of a week. With so much money coming into London, it's been difficult to raise the alarm. Those concerns became harder to ignore last year when Russian forces entered Ukraine, starting what would become a protracted invasion of the small country by its larger neighbor. The move prompted a measured response from the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that has to walk a line between support for Ukraine and outright involvement. With increased attention to Russian money and how it's being used to support the invasion of the Ukraine, there's finally enough political will that changes in financial laws are being put in place to take potentially criminal money out of the London banking system. An economic crimes bill is passed that reinforces the requirement to list primary beneficiaries of foreign-held companies owning properties in the UK and makes the sanctions easier to enforce. It also reforms unexplained wealth orders so that when someone shows up with buckets full of money, they can be compelled to explain how they made those buckets full of money. That last part, as you can imagine, is a bit tricky, and since 2018 when it was enacted, it's only successfully been used 10 times. A new economic crime bill caps the liability for enforcement in an effort to facilitate investigation, but likely comes with its own set of unintended consequences. The second economic crime bill will reform the Companies House that has allowed Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck to be primary beneficiaries of asset holding, and it increases seizure power to cryptocurrency. It will also allow interagency communication on money laundering. It's unclear yet whether or not these measures will end London's reign as the dirty money capital of the world. As the war starts to bring kleptocrats and oligarchs more in focus, it may become harder to hide. Then the question is, what fills the vacuum? The role of international banking and shell companies doesn't come up much when John Wick is punching and stabbing Russian mobsters. It's more of a job for an accounting John Wick. You should see what he can do with a pencil.